All right. Hi, everyone. And I want to welcome you guys to another episode of
paTOK.
paTOK. All right. And as you've noticed, we have a special guest today because our usual, I don't know if having one episode counts as usual, our usual host is not here right now, but we are sending him our love and the blessings care of the rain that's happening outside. Well, I am, as per usual, Mr. Gala, your host, a Langlet and TOK teacher. And our special guest today has to introduce himself.
Hello, hi everyone. So I'm Mr. Michael Ryan Bulosan. I work with Jika and Jeff. We're from Xavier's IB department. I'm the IB Diploma Program Coordinator. I'm working with Jika in teaching TOK. And I started TOK around 3 years ago, and I've started to actually like it or actually even love it. But 3 years ago, to be honest, I hated TOK. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this doing here? I did not understand what TOK was all about. But actually, after having some time, being exposed to TOK, you'll actually like it. And this initiative that we have actually is one way for us to make TOK something a little bit more digestible um, for students, for teachers, and even for parents, anyone in the community who is interested to know more about theory of knowledge. All right.
All right. And thank you, Mr. Bulosan, for gracing us with your presence and that lovely little anecdote about how slowly but surely TOK became accessible and something that you now love. Dare I say love?
Yeah, sure. We can use the word love.
Okay, wow. At panahon na para, okay, pangit yung transition ko, so like, let's cut it from there. But we're going to talk about a certain topic today for this episode of paTOK. And I think that this topic is relevant, especially at this time. This is the October episode. We're actually recording on October 12th. So you might get this episode in a week, the week before SEM test. And I'm sure that this is a very crucial time for you, Mr. Bulos. And why is that the case?
um, well, you students have learned a lot over the course of 2 months or 2.5 months from their DP courses. A lot of times, one of the ways we confirm or affirm or even test and measure learning is by giving assessments. And a lot of times, these assessments are phrased in questions. You will be asked, you will be assessed, and questions are there to validate, questions are there to measure, but those are like the, I wouldn't say generic, but more like those are the standard ways as to how we see questions in education. But questions actually, if you trace it in philosophy, has a very important role in making people realize a lot of things. And when you think about it, assessments now are used to reflect more or less, or to they're there to help you reflect on your learning. Um, Aside from just measuring your learning, that's really the role of assessment. It's not just for you to weigh or measure if you actually learned, but it's really there for you to reflect on your learning. Think about it, like, did I really learn this? Did I really understand this? Do I even like what I learned? That's a lot of times, that a lot of times is something we tend to neglect when we reflect on our learning. We always just ask the what, the why, the when, the where, how, to what extent, even for that matter. But have we asked ourselves, do we even like what we're learning? Right? Sometimes these are the questions we tend to forget to ask ourselves. Questions that do not deal more with what is concrete, but questions that make us reflect on our affect. How do we feel even about this? Especially during the time of the pandemic, right? Wherein we ask a lot of questions like, what are we going to do? Why is this happening? When will this end? But a good question is, what am I getting from this pandemic? Right? What am I learning from this pandemic? Although, of course, there are some perspectives wherein people will say you can't really see this pandemic as a grace. But case in point, this is not about asking yourself whether you find this pandemic as something good for you or bad for you, because that's quite insensitive. But more of like, what are you gaining from this? What are you losing from this pandemic? And with those two questions, how exactly are you living your life because of this pandemic? So there,
Okay.
there
I
you have
get
it.
that. So, Mr. Bulosan, let me just like summarize the points that you just made. So, in essence, the first and foremost encounter with questions in the educational context is one through classrooms and assessments. Am I right?
Yeah,
The
exactly.
second one is maybe to check or reflect on how we perceive our own learning. And then third, and I think as applicable to the situation right now, to just check in on how we are in these very dire times. Am I right?
Yeah, I think a lot
Okay.
of times, I think if I'm going to capture it, now that I think about it, a lot of times we see questions as transactional. I ask you, how are you? You respond to me. But do we always need to look at the answer? Or should we look at how the person actually responded to that question? Have we even asked
Okay.
ourselves that? Di ba? So yeah,
Kinilig ako
I think
doon.
that's something to think about whenever we respond to questions. We ask people, how are you? Yeah, you ask the question, how are you? But at the back of your mind, you're already expecting an answer, right?
Yeah,
What did the
that's a
answer
totally
say?
good point, especially in
Diba?
communication. And I think that's where we're actually coming from. That's why we're going to be talking about questions this time. I think it ties in so well with the last episode about uncertainty, mainly because in light of situations of uncertainty, we tend to be so latched onto particular answers when in fact before we even get the answers in real life, in our assessments, in class and so on, we have to ask questions. And in the
Exactly.
first place, well, in true TOK fashion, let me just define things, all right? As per usual, may
Sure.
kodigo ako, so excuse me kung magbabasa ako. As per Google, when you Google questions definitions, these are the two definitions that appear and I think are most applicable for what we're going to discuss today. First, a question can be considered a noun, a sentence that is worded or expressed so as to elicit information. Okay? A question is something that you ask in order to get to an answer. And the second definition is something also interesting because it refers to question or questioning as a verb, wherein someone expresses doubt about a particular truth or the validity of something. So we're actually going to look at questions today in light of it being a noun, an object, while also being a verb, an action that we do day in and day out without putting any attention to that action.
Right. Actually, I like the two perspectives of questions, right? So simply as a noun, it is, something that is there to elicit information. Or if you look at it as a verb, it's there to express doubt about the truth or validity of something. At some point, of course, when you look at it, it looks like the verb is more of like attacking you. It's like, oh, when you question something, it's something, you know, you're trying to measure, you're trying to weigh if the person really knows what he's talking about. On the other hand, the noun here looks like it's there to elicit information. But that's something that I think we also need to reframe during this time, wherein questions should not be seen as a way of attacking you, but questions are actually there to dig deeper into what has been said. Because not everything, you don't know everything, right? And questions a lot of times prompt better understanding, allow us to think more about a situation, and it really provides us perspective, which I think is very important.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Bulosan, for that input on this matter or this perspective. And really, when it comes down to it, we've been noticing as educators, of course, and as TOK teachers, that students are averse to questions and are averse to questioning the noun and the verb. Students are very much preoccupied with answers. So, for the rest of this episode, we are going to justify to you guys the value of questions. And we actually have three propositions. The first of which being that questions are a way to concretize our doubts or objections as to the truth or validity of something. Diba? So questioning is a way actually, an empowering way for us to express that, oy, parang may mali dito. Kailangan nating i-verify kung mali yun. Secondarily, another proposition is that questions are a way to test or verify what we know. Of course, this is the easiest way or the most common way that we encounter questions in the classroom. Because there are check-in questions this time in Excel to check your learning at the end of the session, of course. And lastly,
Yeah.
questions are also a way to, well, navigate uncertainty. Ang ganda ng tahi talaga sa last session. I'm gonna pat my back for that. Because, well, instead of focusing on answers, we in TOK and we, the hosts of this podcast, Mr. Bulosan, included in the fold this time around, believe that questions are actually very much empowering. To get to an answer,
Mhm.
you have to ask a question first. To move from uncertainty, you have to ask the necessary questions to get to the answers to make you certain. So that's our flow for today. And we're going to attack those propositions of value one at a time. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Bulosan. The floor is yours. I'm going to leave now.
Okay, so the first proposition, that's question, is a way to concretize doubts and objections. So in everyday life, we always have questions. It could be as simple as questioning your parents, like why is this the policy, or why is this the rule? How come I can't eat dessert after 8 p.m., or how come I can't go outside? How come I'm not supposed to watch TV to more than 3 hours? So those are some questions, and it prompts us to doubt. It's prompting us to ask these questions because at some point maybe we're doubting whatever information we know, or maybe we object. So it's possible also that it's an objection. So one thing here is that the more we know about something, the more we realize that we don't actually know, right? So whenever we ask questions, we think that we really want to know the answer, um, because we think that we already know an answer at the back of our mind. That's why we question. But then if we do get the answer, we end up realizing, oh no, we actually don't know the answer. And the more we actually question, it makes us realize that our doubts may not even be valid to begin with. That makes sense. Like you ask your parents, how come I can't go outside? Is it because you just want this or you want that? And then you realize that the reasoning is actually quite different. So at some point, it's there to guide us, to help us realize that our doubts should not be doubts to begin with, but rather we just like the comfort of being secured, of being given an answer, right?
Yeah.
Very practical relationships. You want to define the relationships. What do we call that? D DR define the
Define the relation.
DTR. Yeah, DTR. Like everyone is so into the DTR thing. Like we have to define this because you have doubts. You have objections. Is it really
Oh.
true what I'm feeling? Is it really true what you're feeling? So you have to define it. So you ask questions. So what are we? Right? So that's a very practical way of doing it. Because doubting is an evidence of experience and knowledge. Because you've
Mm.
experienced the relationship, you ask questions. Um, because you experience something, because there is new knowledge that came in, you realize that there's more knowledge actually to be gained. And then when the more you actually ask questions, you realize you don't know that much at all, right? So asking questions actually allow us to um, not just doubt other people or doubt the knowledge that we have, but sometimes we also tend to doubt ourselves. But that doubt is something that we should not actually feel uncomfortable of. Because a lot of times we tend to be uncomfortable about that when we're doubting something. But actually, it only makes us realize that there's value. We put value into that knowledge. We put value to it because it's important for us. We want to know. We want to know if what we know is justified, if it's true, and we really should believe it, right? So yeah, that's very
Tama.
TOK in the KTB uh, perspective. So there. So yeah,
Okay.
that's one proposition. That's one perspective of questions.
Well, how do you say this, Mr. Bulosan? You're talking about doubts that shouldn't have even been there in the first place. I'm sorry, but that's totally relatable from the teacher perspective because you know how, sorry, students, if you feel attacked right now, but this is not, this is just something to illustrate things. Like, for example, when your teacher has something on the board, like, for example, it says blue or black pen, and
Mhm.
then immediately after giving the instruction, a student raises their hand in the Zoom call or outside. Well, wala na palang blue or black pen ngayon. Or outside in real life and they ask, sure, blue or black pen, right after you've talked about it? Guys, in those situations, think of why you asked the question in the first place. Is it because you already have previous knowledge that needs to be verified? Or because you have sincere and absolute doubt about the claim or the directive that's being given to you by your teacher? Your doubts can be founded on two things, as per Mr. Bulosan. First is you have a pretty solid base of knowledge that you just want to check, the cross check or like litmus test. The other basis of your doubts is likely the desire for security. You exactly. Some of you, and I myself am guilty of this, and I'm sure it's just human nature, that sometimes we ask questions because we genuinely doubt the knowledge that we have when faced with new information, or sometimes we ask questions because we need security. We need to be affirmed.
That's true. That's very,
And
very
that's why
true.
you
And
need the
it
labels. I sorry, sir. Go
exactly.
ahead.
Well, relationships, di ba? It's more of really I think it's really part of one of the needs that people have. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, di ba? You need that kind of affirmation, not just from others, but eventually you also need affirmation from yourself, right? So there. That's why questions matter. They prompt that kind of affirmation of something. And speaking of affirmations, right? So another proposition which Jika will be talking about is how questions help us to verify or to test what we know. And we'll try to put the cross section between these two propositions because at some point, to some extent, they look the same because it's about verifying and testing, and then, but also we have to point out how doubts themselves play a crucial role here when it comes to
Mhm.
questions. So
All
go,
right.
Jika.
Thanks, Mr. Bulosan, for that segue, that introduction. Sige, tatry ko siyang going very as clear as I can make it. So, the first proposition is that questions are necessary to voice out doubts or objections. Well, the second step after that is to ask further questions to verify what we know. So, you can actually think of the first proposition as the first step toward getting to the second proposition of questions values, wherein we use questions to verify or test that which we know. And this is actually, as I said a while ago, how we encounter questions most often in the educational context. In class, your teachers go into the classroom, give you information, give you data, um, orient you as to various processes for solving math problems, conducting experiments, reading a text. Have I missed a subject? Yes, I have. I know that I have because those are only three subjects. Okay, study or process or analyze case studies. O, diba? May soksay na tayo doon. Um, but your teacher comes in with a wealth of information or knowledge that you have to process. Okay. And the way that we enable you to process it is to pose questions on your behalf. Often in the classroom setting, you do not ask the questions, of course, unless it's like the technical sure, blue or black pen, but rather we give you the information and then we ask you the questions in order for you to process that information further. Nakapagod yun. Okay pa ba kayo? Mr. Bulosan, okay ba? Did it make sense?
Yeah, it totally made sense. I totally agree with you on that one.
Okay. So this is the part where I go into talking about areas of knowledge or the various subjects or disciplines that utilize questions and the way that they do so. I think the most basic way to go about this is, of course, not to use our areas of expertise, but to go to math.
Yeah.
Syempre,
Let's go to
math.
math. Are we ready?
Let's go to math because I think it's the easiest example. And oddly enough, right now, I have two toothbrushes that are identical. So So we'll use these to illustrate my point, but and I hope it gets across. Like for example, in mathematics, the basic premise is that um, if you have one thing and add it with another thing, you end up with two things. Diba? Now, of course, that's easily illustrated when I show you one toothbrush and the second toothbrush, and then obviously when I put it together, you see two toothbrushes. Clear, diba? That's easy because there's a correspondence between real life and our understanding of real life. That becomes a bit more complicated, of course, when instead of objects, we start using numbers or we start using digits. One, the number one, now has to be added to another number one, which are signs that represent maybe toothbrushes, maybe rocks, maybe apples, so on and so forth. And that's actually a leap in logic for humans. Now it seems like I'm talking about psychology, but it is human nature for people to check correspondences between signs on paper, the number one as it's written, and of course, objects in real life. And how do we
Mhm.
verify that indeed this toothbrush can correspond to the number one as it is written in paper? Well, often we have to trust the process. Is that related to basketball? I think that's a quote from basketball. But yeah, we have to trust the process and we have to trust human nature. Diba? And in order for us to check in on that, well, I like to use my nephew, my 5-year-old nephew, as an example. Because watching him learn math and reading is very much interesting. He does not ask questions anymore as to one toothbrush equals the number one, but he asks questions about how this could be replaced with this, a pen. And he asks
Uh,
questions like, okay, yes, it is a fountain pen because we're fountain pen friends. Yes. A digression. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my point. So mga pen friends dyan, hi. Um, what do you call this?
oh,
My nephew has no problems making connections between an object and the number one on paper. But sometimes he will encounter another object and ask me, does one pen also equate to the number one? Does two pens equate to the number two? Does two pairs of pants equate to the number two as well? And those questions all seek to verify everything that he knows. And it's amusing as heck to watch. I don't know how children work, but there's some magic going on. And that's, I guess, a fine example or one example of how we verify what we know. I mean, all you really have to do is to look at the child to understand that verifying what we know is human nature. It's natural, it's instinctual. Referring maybe to the ways of knowing for grade 12, o, diba?
okay. Yes. Because the grade 11 don't have walks anymore. You have the 12
Congratulations,
TOK
grade
key
12s.
concepts.
True.
Right. Exactly.
So, Mr. Bulosan, what about our last proposition as to the value of,
Right. The
yeah.
third proposition, questions is a way to navigate uncertainty or to obtain certainty, which I think is very much related to the discussion the previous paTOK episode. Um, so when I think about questions, in order to navigate uncertainty, or a lot of times we do ask questions to obtain certainty. I'll give you first a very personal example. So I think for some of you, you've heard already of what happened to my dad. He recently got a stroke. Yeah, and then he's recovering. But one of the one of the faculties which is not working exceptionally as of the moment is his language. He can't speak so much. And a lot of times, whenever I would ask him questions like, um, what did you eat for lunch? What did you watch? Very simply questions that at some point related to the previous questions, like verifying or checking the doubts. But it's really more of getting some certainty that I want to be certain that you're okay. I want to be certain that you know what's happening. I want to be certain that you still remember things, right? And every time I do ask these questions, like what did you eat, what did you watch, he would always struggle with the words, and I always have this wrong tendency to say, okay, just tell me if you remember it or know it already. But he would always tell me, no, it's this. He didn't say it's this, but like he would touch his mouth and he would tell me that it's not because he doesn't know it, but rather he cannot speak it. So actually, this is a case in point in language, right? I remember our lesson in grade 11.
Yes.
Like, can language capture all of knowledge? And
Oh,
knowledge be communicated by language, right? So yeah, this is a cross section, Jika. But it just made me realize that I ask questions in order to obtain some certainty. And the reality is, we should not always ask questions simply to obtain certainty, but actually asking questions should be there to navigate these uncertainties, to help us understand these uncertainties, and be comfortable with the idea that we don't have the answer always, all the time. But rather, these questions can guide us, but these should not be the end point. But rather, this should be part of the whole process of finding certainty. So there, I think, yeah. So questions are not really meant to be answered, but these questions are meant to make us see, um, to make us see what we know, to make us see the reality of what we know, and for us to make us see also how comfortable we are with not being certain with a lot of things in a world which itself is not certain. So there. I don't. Is
oh
that
my
still TOK?
God.
Yes,
Oh
that's
my
TOK.
God. It's still TOK. It absolutely is. And I'm just thankful that you were so open with being vulnerable with us in this community. And like, I mean,
Or
that's a fine example really of how TOK is that subject that lets you see how all the lessons actually appear in real life, that they're of value there, and that certain skills that we often don't pay attention to, like questioning, and certain predicaments or circumstances that we often avoid, like uncertainty, are actually integral to us coming to terms with the world. Oh,
exactly. Yeah.
that's
Actually, when you think about it, the only reason actually, when you think about why do great scholars ask questions, we already have answers. In the past, we already assumed that the model of the universe or the solar system is geocentric, right? We all
heliocentric.
believe,
Geocentric,
right?
sorry.
The Earth is the center of the solar system, but then it changed into heliocentric. It was a paradigm shift. But when you ask yourself why, if there was already an answer, and at some point there was already some certainty there, how come there were still doubts? How come people were still uncertain? And that's the thing with questions. It would remind us of reality that is happening in this world, and that is impermanence. And by asking questions, it's not saying that we're not sure, but rather we accept the impermanence of this world, and that whatever we know now may be provisional, right? So
Oh,
there.
that's so beautiful. All I really wrote in our código, in our outline, is that our point is that questions are empowering.
Yeah.
They
They
really
are.
are.
They really are
And
empowering.
yeah, we just want to encourage everyone to ask those questions. But please ask questions in an appropriate and timely manner. Hindi yung kakasabi lang, tatanungin nyo na. Hindi yung after 2 weeks, doon lang tayo magtatanong sa email. Diba? Because we're all prone to this right now, wherein we need immediate answers or we delay asking the questions to get us the answers that we need. Maybe one thing that we can also focus on when tackling or discussing questions is that First, questions are empowering. Often they're actually more important than answers. Second, questions have an effectivity period. They're best asked at a particular time, in pertinence to a particular topic and a given place, so on and so forth. And you have to take all these into consideration in order for you to get maybe not to an absolutely sure answer, but to move forward and have access to multiple and all feasible answers.
Exactly.
Ayun. And with that, we have 1 minute.
We have 1 more minute. Okay.
We have 1 more minute. Go ahead, Mr. Bulosan.
I think the important thing to remember about questions is that I think most of us have already hear this from or heard of this from our teachers in grade school, high school, and when we were younger. There's no shame in asking questions, and indeed, our great philosophers made sense of the world through questions, but they didn't ask questions begging for an answer. But sometimes even you have to be comfortable with the idea that your question will bring about more questions. And so my tendency is when someone would ask me a question and I know that that person knows the answer, you know what I'll do? I'll ask a question also.
True.
I mean, I'm sure you know the answer. You're just uncertain. You're just confirming if what you know is true. Or maybe you have doubts. But if I ask you a follow-up question, you realize you'll actually shed light onto your doubts. Or you might even end up confirming what you believe in. So that's the beauty of questions. It's not really there to, questions themselves actually can answer your own questions. And that's something quite interesting to see, not just in everyday life, but actually, in TOK, that happens a lot. Our questions bring about answers. Our questions bring about more questions, which lead us to answers. And should we be happy with the answers or should we be satisfied with the answers? Not really. Because in the end, impermanence is a very important concept we need to learn to embrace, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have questions. So how many cases do we have now? This much number. But that will keep on changing. We can't claim that based on the numbers that we're doing a good job or like we beat COVID-19. But rather, we have to be open with the idea that we have to keep on asking questions. What can we do more to address these?
And exactly, maybe we should close with that note, mainly because we actually want to hear what you want to ask us. And so after posting this, maybe via YouTube or via Facebook or whatever other platform that we post it on, comment with a question that you find relevant to ask. All right. Maybe not just to us, but maybe to the greater Xavier, IB, senior high school, junior high school community. We're all open to your questions because, again, we want you to exercise that experience of empowerment for yourselves. And with that, it's time to sign off, Mr. Bulosan. Have you decided on how to sign off? It was.
Thank you so much, Jika, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode. And yes, we're doing this not because TOK is going to be pa-TOK, but it's like paTOK that will knock your brain. And that's the goal, to make you realize that everyday life, there is TOK.
Oh my God, TOK everywhere, guys. And with that, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half or so with us. And thank you, Mr. Bulosan, for gracing us with your presence. Hopefully, maulit ito. Salamat sa inyong lahat, guys. Thank you. I'm Miss Jika Regala, Langlit and TOK, and he is our special guest, Mr.
Bulosan, IBDP coordinator and TOK teacher.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.